All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. You can also follow my guest today, Christian Toto, on Twitter at Hollywood in Toto. He is the editor-in-chief of the Hollywood in Toto website, which you can find at hollywoodintoto.com. Christian, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Hey, my pleasure. It's fun.
So I have a ton of things to ask you about because despite the pandemic's effect in terms of driving people in directions that of crappy reality TV yet unplumbed, we also have a good deal of created culture of interest to talk about. I want to start with this whole Netflix controversy, which has played out over the past 48 hours or so, though it's been a running undercurrent for the past couple of weeks regarding this movie Cuties that got such a real backlash from the internet community. Tell me a little bit about what's going on here and how you see this story.
Well, this is a French film. It was bought by Netflix, so it's now available to be seen on the Netflix service. And it's about a young girl who is struggling in her life. She's about 11 or so, and she falls into this group of other girls like her age, and they are dancing very provocatively. They're twerking, and she's sort of in this cultural kind of chasm where her family is very conservative, very religious, but now she's feeling these different urges to kind of go with a different group. Now, the filmmaker behind it has talked about how she was being critical of the sort of hypersexualization of children. And it's certainly an interesting message to talk about in a feature film. It's also a challenging one. And we found that out a few weeks ago when the film's poster made its debut. And it showed these young girls in these very kind of skimpy dance outfits, striking very provocative poses. And of course, the internet and social media went crazy. How dare you? How dare you? And I get that. And Netflix said, hey, we're pulling the poster. You're right. That was an inappropriate visual. But you have to see the movie. It's not really representative of the movie itself. Well, now the movie's out, and I've seen some clips of it, and there are there are sequences that go on for quite some time where you've got young girls dressed in mature outfits, dancing provocatively, and the camera is capturing every moment of it. You know, if you want to debate this issue, fine. If you want to critique this issue, fine. But I haven't seen the full movie, but I've seen enough to say, my golly, there's got to be a creative choice that would have been better than showing this in all its glory. And of course, people again are freaking out.
I've read a number of reviews of this film, and I've seen the clips. I don't plan to watch the full movie. The critique that I've heard from a lot of people is that, well, there is something at the end that suggests that the main character has, learned a lesson or shifting away from this sexualization in an overt way, but that it seems very pat and that it doesn't come across as very genuine. And my own response would be, I'm not sure I particularly care, because the context of the clips that that have been put out matter less at a certain point than the fact that you chose to do this in such an aggressive way with such young girls. I mean, one example of this that I was thinking of was, somehow Spotlight was able to make a movie about, everything that went on within the Catholic priesthood related to sexual abuse without ever actually showing some form of sexual abuse. You don't necessarily need to put these things in such an overt way. You can suggest without also supplying material that would appeal to exactly the audience you might be wanting to critique with this.
It's a great point. I was just I was reading some older reviews recently for a related story. There was a movie 8, 9, 10 years ago, The Stoning of Sorayam. It's about an Iranian woman falsely accused of being of adultery, and she's stoned to death. The title is the spoiler alert. And a lot of critics said, well, the movie really shows the stoning. It kind of goes through that process. And the critics were outraged. How dare you? You can tell the story without doing this. It's exploitative. You didn't need to kind of go there. Well, it seems like Cuties goes there. And for the exact same reason you said, it didn't have to. There are a million different ways to capture what she was up against without having a 2-hour dance-a-thon with a leering camera showing these girls in just a disgusting way. So listen, I suspect we're on the same page. We're all for freedom of expression. Storytellers can tell their stories, but gosh, when it comes to kids, little girls, and a story involving sexualization, you would think that a more delicate touch would be appropriate here, especially if the message is what she says, the filmmaker, and her name is escaping me,
Mhm.
is that she wanted to do a commentary about this and why it's not appropriate.
Netflix is obviously a behemoth. They're gigantic. They are undergoing some changes in terms of their leadership at the moment. Uh, is this the first thing to come along that you've seen where the outrage against Netflix seemed significant enough to maybe have an impact on future decisions that they make?
It's possible. It's a cumulative effect too. I think we're seeing that the streaming service is certainly left of center. Their deal with the Obamas, Susan Rice is on the board. A lot of their content leans to the left. There's a lot of sort of social justice engineering built into this. So it's, I think, taken alone, the cutie situation is one thing, but I think there's sort of a narrative coming up here. But yeah, and the Netflix reaction was interesting. At first, they kind of stayed quiet, no comment. Now they're defending it, and so if it's going to be, will they pay a price that is significant enough where they're going to reverse course, which is possible. But at the end of the day, if you are against this, if you are aghast at what they're doing, you have to cancel your Netflix subscription. I mean, as a cultural critic and as a film critic, I never want to go there, but I don't know how else you send a message, because the media right now is covering for Netflix, siding with Netflix, attacking the critics and not this film. And in 2 days, this story is over. And the story only endures, only lingers if people are outraged enough to actually take action. But I suspect it won't happen. I think people love their Netflix. It's a great service. I get it. And I think we're seeing it across the board that all these different institutions are basically insulting half the country, and half the country is often taking it. Yes, the NBA and the NFL ratings may be going down, but not enough maybe to have a significant impact.
Let's talk a little bit about this Oscars diversity agenda. Tell me a little bit about what it requires, what you think of it, and whether you think it's going to be enough to satisfy the different voices out there that want to see more diversity. Because to me, whenever you decide to go down this road of quota systems, someone feels left out inevitably, or they feel persecuted against, and you only have more and more requests for changes.
That's a great point. You can never be woke enough.
Mhm.
No matter how far you go, it's never enough. You need to go further. I mentioned this a lot. There's a movie called Booksmart. It came out last year. It was maybe the most woke comedy I've ever seen. It was really over the top. You know what? I liked it. It was good. It was funny. It was clever. It was well put together. It was interesting. It was different. It was sort of a teen comedy with a unique perspective. But when that movie came out, I'm thinking, oh, wow, look at that. It's as woke as possible. And then there were several different media outlets saying, well, no, the characters were white. They may have been straight. They were privileged. They were, middle class. So you're never woke enough. So that's just sort of the setting here. Now, the Oscar rules are very complex. I can't relate them all. I don't have them all memorized, but it's a series of steps that the filmmakers and studios have to follow in order to be included in the Oscar race. So if your movie doesn't sort of check off these boxes, then you cannot be considered for the Best Picture category, which is obviously the creme de la creme. It's the biggest prize in Oscarland. Now, the different rules are staggered. You don't have to check every box. But if your cast isn't diverse enough, you've missed that box. You have to kind of go to the second box. That might be, what is the theme of the movie? Does that satisfy the social justice criteria? If that doesn't work, maybe you need to have 30-40% of the behind the scenes crew be people of minorities, people in marginalized communities by definition from the group. So it's all these different layers, but there's lots of things wrong with it, obviously. One is it should be about the greatest movies. It should be about artistic excellence, full stop. There are going to be a lot of film productions that maybe won't go ahead because they can't meet all these different categories. And I think about the indie films, which often are able to compete with the majors because they've made great movies. Well, some of these categories involve funding different minority outreach programs, paid internships. Well, these indie studios, they don't have a lot of cash at hand. They may not be able to even compete with it. And then also, I feel like you're building a two-tier system where in the past, a movie like Black Panther could be fun and exciting and a blockbuster and a Best Picture category nominee. Now it's going to be like, well, we've got this movie, we can't check all these boxes, so it's not going to be a Best Picture contender. So I think what you're going to see is all these movies that are in the category, in the race, are going to be serious and sober and political and woke and very message driven, which is boring. That could be part of the mix, but it shouldn't be the entire mix.
I just want to run through them real quick.
Yeah.
The standard A that you referenced, lead or significant supporting actors, at least one of the lead actors or significant supporting actors is from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group. A general ensemble cast, at least 30% of all actors in secondary or more minor roles are from at least two of the following underrepresented groups. Or main storyline subject matter, the main storyline, theme, or narrative of the film is centered on an underrepresented group. The standard B that you talked about, to me, seems to be the more likely approach that a lot of these places are going to use when they're telling stories, just given that it involves at least two of the following creative leadership positions and department heads are from the following underrepresented groups. Other key roles, basically you just have to have a crew that's more diverse. And so if you're telling, let's say, take, a movie that would obviously have some difficulty in qualifying this under the current measure is The Godfather. It's overwhelmingly Italian, or to people who haven't seen it. It is not. It is overwhelmingly male. It's overwhelmingly male, and overwhelmingly male. And so it's one of these things where this would have some difficulty. I actually wonder. I'm not sure this is the case. But I'm actually curious whether The Irishman would have qualified under this rule. Maybe it would have on the behind the scenes stuff. But this is a situation where Hollywood wants to send a message that it has more diversity to the way that it does things, and yet when you look at the way that they approach this, because it is designed to incentivize a paint by numbers approach to making films, you're going to end up with films that are often probably less creative and more trying to satisfy one of these things. I think of a film that was on a lot of critics' lists last year, The Lighthouse, which is obviously Robert Pattinson, Willem Dafoe. It's a black and white movie, but a lot of critics, really loved it. It got, awards and things like that. There's no way it qualifies. It's two white guys in a room for most of the film, and so I just don't think that there's a situation where you can necessarily, attain these things. And there's also historical challenges. You look at a film, one of my favorites, 1917. How are you supposed to have a representation of female characters, Hispanic characters, Black characters, Indigenous Native American characters, Middle Eastern, North African, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander in that story? Because it would just be completely, out of touch with the way that the history actually happened.
Yeah, there's other factors here too. A lot of times filmmakers have relationships with fellow crew members. It could be a cinematographer, it could be lighting people, whatever it is. They have a camaraderie, they've got a relationship, they've got a past. It's one of those things where they kind of don't have to speak, they kind of just know what each other wants. So if you've got that scenario where the diversity has to go into the crew, then all of a sudden maybe you're severing some of these ties that may have been built up for years, if not decades. I just wonder what a Martin Scorsese thinks about all this. And another level is movie making is extraordinarily complicated. To get everything to fall in line, the money, the release date, the marketing, the casting, the creative differences, it's a powder keg. And the fact that any movie gets made is often like a tiny miracle. Now you weave in all these different layers of, well, not only do we have to do all of that, we've got to do this and this and this. It just seems it's going to be oppressive in a way. And listen, on the plus side, it may introduce some new voices, some new talented people who maybe didn't have a chance before this. But ultimately, that's on Hollywood, that they weren't letting people of color get a full shake. and have a full share of the Hollywood dream. I mean, part of this is a guilt thing where they know that, female representation behind the camera is lousy, and minority representation has suffered and for many, many years. So I think it's kind of a guilt situation where, hey, we're trying to fix it, but it seems like a horrible way to fix it.
The thing I was actually thinking about as I was reading that list of different underrepresented races is you realize that there's only one bullet on that list that would apply to the massive ensemble cast that is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's not, I mean, there's not a Pacific Islander in there. There's not an indigenous person. There's not I mean, there isn't an Asian superhero in their mix. They have a couple of Asian characters. There's no Hispanic superhero in the mix. The only Hispanic character in the MCU is sidekicks. And so this is a situation where, like, even something that's as, diverse or looks as diverse as that would not qualify under all of those other measures, which kind of says something about the casting choices that are made here.
Yeah. Listen, another oppressed group in Hollywood, probably the most oppressed group, conservatives. They can't even say what they want to vote for, who they want to vote for, without experiencing some sort of punishment. Is a sort of a soft blacklist. How many actors say, I can't do this, I can't say that, I've lost gigs? We hear it every year. There's a new mainstream media story about that. I talk to actors often who say, listen, could you not say, who I vote for, my political affiliation? I don't want to get in trouble. For every Tim Allen, there are many, many people who are literally in the conservative closet. I didn't see them listed in this whole new rules and regulations. And that's significant. I mean, I don't want a quota for conservatives, but if you're going to be open about it, let's talk about that.
I think Dean Cain can make a different quota too. So tell me a little bit about, just shifting away from kind of this sad circumstance. Tell me a little bit about the way that the industry has been dealing with the limits of the coronavirus. We saw the release of Christopher Nolan's Tenet here in America this past weekend. And as much as it had been an anticipated film, and obviously he's one of the few directors who can do interesting big projects with ensemble casts that get not just good critical attention, but also big money at the box office. It's a situation where when it was released in Europe, it made more money than it did here in America. There seemed to be a lot higher hesitation on the part of Americans to go out to the theater, even with AMC, the biggest theater company in the country, opening 400 locations over the past couple of weeks. What do you think about that? And what do you think people are taking away from it as a sign of what they ought to do? We saw today, for instance, Wonder Woman's sequel delayed until Christmas. Do you think more of that's going to happen?
Potentially. The other big movie is the James Bond movie, No Time to Die. That one's still slated for November. So I think it's safe right now. But yeah, listen, the media has scared us to death. And that's sort of a hyperbolic phrase about the pandemic. Now, there are lots of reasons to be wary. There are lots of reasons to be afraid. There are lots of people dying, sadly. But I think, just on a sort of a personal level, I walk outside my house and I see people who are walking with their dog wearing a mask, even though they're outside in the sun with no one anywhere near them. I go to the local ice cream shop, which is always packed in the summertime, and there's no line anymore, even though they've set up their shop in a way that's very, very safe, very efficient, very clean. I can't even imagine how you could possibly get COVID from this ice cream shop. So I think you've got that. I think people are just scared across the board. I think you've got, habits change over, was it 2 months or so? It takes to kind of change your habit. Well, everyone's been locked down and watching Netflix, and Netflix and all their different competitors have been pumping out fresh new material that's as good as anything you'd see in the theaters. So I think we're getting used to that. So I think Hollywood is nervous, and they should be. I also think that, celebrities could have used these past few months to maybe drop their hardcore political messaging and been more inclusive, had been more friendly, have been more outreaching to the community and saying, hey, we're all in this together. Gosh, we hope you come back to the movies. It's a part of our lives. We work so hard for you. We're so grateful that you're there for us. We can't wait to see you again. I think if they had kind of taken that message, it would have been more productive. But instead, it's been rancorous. It's been mean. It's been mocking people who are, protesting lockdowns. It's been surly. We've had stars basically cheer on the riots. Trevor Noah on The Daily Show has essentially done just that. So I think it's a perfect storm of changing habits, of having, the theatrical experience was kind of a pain to begin with the high prices and the people talking, and the product isn't always there. You've got great alternatives on streaming. All those things come together. Hollywood's in trouble. I don't see any other situation right now.
There's a question that I had about the pipeline, and I don't know if you know this personally or if you've talked to people about it, but there's a pipeline of material that was mostly filmed or even entirely filmed that was in the editing stages, that's still getting built up to be able to be released. And so we still see trailers that drop. There was a Vince Vaughn horror movie from Blumhouse that had a trailer drop the other day. The Dune trailer is out from Denis Villeneuve. There's still kind of an anticipation of some content coming out there. My question is it going to change the way that we consume content dependent on when these things were being made? I know, for instance, that the Blacklist show ended its last season with this weird situation where they kind of the main characters came on and said, hey, this is about in the episode where we had to stop filming, but we wanted to finish this storyline for you and not leave you hanging. So the rest of it is sort of animated and like done in a different way. Do you think we're going to see more animated content, different forms of content, maybe a lot more junk reality TV? What is it going to do in terms of the content we can expect over the next 6 months or so?
It's interesting. I think with movies, there were so many movies that were bumped and delayed that I think if we can get to a place in 6 months where we're back to normal in shooting, I don't think there's going to be a big hiccup because there's so many films that were just not available. TV is different. I think we're seeing some hybrids. There's a show coming any day now called Coastal Elites. It's on HBO. I think it might be kind of a one and done. It's sort of a presentation, but it looks like there's a bunch of Zoom calls. So I think you've got that. I just read that Saturday Night Live is going to be in studio in October doing their shows. So I think the industry is sort of creeping back into a version of normal. But yeah, and I think that audiences are a little bit more open to things right now. I mean, listen, we're all working at home and doing Zoom conversations as opposed to face-to-face interviews. So I think we're more amenable to sort of these creative solutions. So I think that's what it is. But I think when it comes to Hollywood and video on demand, I think the movies like Bill and Ted 3, I just think they're going to be more obvious choices to go on home streaming as opposed to theater, because you want to see James Bond in a theater. Do I need to see Bill and Ted in a theater? I don't think so.
Yeah. I also feel like there has to be a lot of impact here on the whole theater industry. The sustainability of so many of these locations is really in question. As you said, there was already the high markup for both the tickets and for food. What's your perspective on the theater industry going forward? And particularly, do you think that this is an opportunity to maybe reassess what we do with theaters as a model and create a new style or a new approach to the way that people watch movies?
Well, I think what we've seen in recent years is theaters, at least in my neck of the woods, getting more comfortable, having more options, more food options, reclining seats, leather. It's not just sort of the spring in the back that drives you crazy during the theatrical run. So that's part of it. I've always liked to think that theaters can't go away because there's nothing that's going to replicate being in a crowded theater where everyone's laughing, where everyone's watching a horror movie and everyone's shrieking or clutching their armrest. That there's a shared experience there that's impossible to replicate. And also it's fun to watch a movie with my wife, but we went a couple days ago to a recent screening. My wife was so giddy that we were out in a theater watching a movie. It felt like an event. There's always something like that about the theatrical experience, that it's taking you out. Maybe you'll have a restaurant meal prior or after. That is a conversation. Like it's a social event. And I think if they can kind of cling to that, then the theatrical model can survive. But I mean, these are headwinds that are sizable, from fear, from the content being not as good, from Netflix and company just giving us so much good stuff that is as good, if not better, than what you see at a big screen. You know, if I see a movie on Netflix and it stinks, A, I don't care that much, and B, I might just tune out in 20 minutes. But if I'm stuck in a movie theater, I paid 10, $20 for a seat, maybe more for popcorn. It's a wasted night. I've got to sit there the whole thing. And there are different expectations involved.
How can the movie theater food experience be improved in a way that draws more people in? And let me just ask, in this way, I've been to a lot of the different Alamo locations, and I know that Austin in particular has become a little bit more innovative recently in other movie chains trying new things. Is there a way to elevate that a little bit to be able to have banquettes, or to have if we're going to have a lower percentage of occupancy in a lot of these places, is there a way to deal with that also makes it for kind of a dining experience or something like that that's a little bit higher end than what you're getting from stale chicken fingers and popcorn that's cold by the time you get to your seat?
You know, I'm a huge Alamo fan. There are several locations here in Denver. I think they do it right on a number of levels. And listen, I don't know the economics, how to crunch the numbers of, well, if we make crappy popcorn, but that's the way we keep our business alive. I don't know enough about that, but I do know that if you make the experience better across the board, and Alamo does that, it's not just the fact that there's a lot of food and different options and shakes and meals that are quality-wise rock solid, but also they show funky shorts before the movie. They make it feel like an experience. It's not just hitting play on your Blu-ray player or your streaming device. It's goofy stuff. It's kind of like making it an event in a way. And I think that's something that they can do with maybe more creativity, where they don't have to spend a gazillion dollars to make it happen. You know, I went to see Jumanji, one of the Jumanji films recently, at an Alamo, and beforehand they had a Jack Black short where he was appearing on a Japanese game show and doing goofy, wacky things. I'm thinking, I never would have seen this elsewhere. I didn't know it existed. And Jack Black's in the movie. So it made it different and special. And I think if theaters get more creative, then I think that's at a competitive advantage. But I don't, again, in the crunching the numbers, I'm not really sure.
We haven't talked about China yet, and I think we need to. The effect that China has had in driving changes in Hollywood, I think, can't be underestimated, of course. There's all manner of proof of that. The latest example of this, of course, is the controversy over Disney's Mulan. Their chief financial officer acknowledged on Thursday that the choice to shoot parts of the film in the Xinjiang region has, quote, generated a lot of issues for us. Issues in this case relating to them giving special thanks to several different Chinese government organs, including a number of which are involved directly in the campaign that seems to be either a cultural or a very real genocide of the Uyghur people. Why do you think that Disney took its eye off the ball on this one? Because I feel like they could have gotten away with not thanking them and nobody would have noticed. But at the same time, this is a situation where clearly their mindset is focused on speaking to the middle class of China and using them in terms of more of a profit focus than people here in America. What does that mean for them and for other major Hollywood companies as they're producing new content?
I think it's arrogance. I think they know for the most part that the media will not really castigate them. I think there's been a couple of news stories. I think news cycle wise, I think it's already over. I don't think, unless there's an outrage, unless other politicians bring this up, it's sort of like a one and done. They want the money and they want to appease China. And that's the bottom line. And I think if all these different Hollywood companies and actors, if they just kind of said, we want the money, period. In a way, I'd kind of respect that. It would be sort of a very obvious, overt, we're just doing it for the buck. But they want to have it both ways. Disney wants to say, well, we may not shoot in Georgia because we don't agree with the local legislation regarding abortion rights, but we're going to go shoot in China. even though there's a concentration camp around the block. The actors in Hollywood want to say, we support Me Too, it really is important. And then they want to look the other way when Joe Biden has a Me Too movement. I cover Hollywood, the hypocrisy, which is always off the charts. I need a new metaphor. I need a new way to kind of capture it. So, that's where they are. They want to have it both ways. They want to be a political machine. They want to send the message, and then they want to get away with what they want to get away with for money. So that's, and again, it's up to us. And, you and I talk about this. The average person, to my eyes, they just want to put their kids to bed. They want to make a living. They want to clean their house. They don't have time to get into minutia of what China is up to. And I think Disney's banking on that.
I am curious as to your perspective on the streaming marketplace and who's in the best position at the moment. There's so many different things out there. And obviously, for many consumers, they have to prioritize their dollar and choose which things that they're going to subscribe to. There's also the creation of these kind of fake bundles where you have agreements between certain companies in order to have their product. For instance, getting Hulu through your Spotify subscription, getting Disney Plus a year free under Verizon Mobile, things like that. At the same time, this stuff stacks up and it ends up being essentially the same amount you would have been paying for cable. And especially if you're buying into the HBO products, which are pretty overpriced. What do you think is going to be the approach of the consumer in this vein? And is part of the issue that people are going to run into where they have to make choices within this landscape, and they'll end up dropping certain things if they don't have enough good or fresh content after a month or two?
Yeah, it's very complicated. To me, Netflix and Amazon Prime do it right because they've got a lot of shows, they've got a lot of movies, and they're putting out original content that is very good. There's some junk in there too. But if I go on Amazon Prime and I see an Amazon Prime original movie, chances are it's a Hollywood level production like I might see in a theater. Other services I don't get. Apple TV, I'm wildly confused by. I mean, it doesn't seem like they've got a wealth of content. They've got some original programming, that's fine, but I can't imagine adding that to my repertoire when I can add an Amazon Prime, which is, I spend half my leisure time surfing through all the different choices. It's so mind-boggling. So yeah, I also don't understand how Netflix does it because they're spending gobs of money. I don't know how they kind of balance the ledger sheets at the end of the day. But I think ultimately the consumer is going to be the beneficiary. I think they're going to have to keep their subscription rates low. I think they're going to have to kind of create new content. It's a little bit like HBO versus Showtime. They've got all the generic movies, each of those services, but the original shows, what matters? I care more about Game of Thrones, or do I care more about Ray Donovan? Mm-hmm. So I think ultimately we are the benefactors. And again, if they make it where it's as expensive as cable or worse, then I think we're going to tune out. Or maybe I'll say, hey, I'm going to subscribe to Netflix for this month. I'm going to quit. I'm going to wait 6 months. And all of a sudden there'll be the whole fresh array of content that I missed over that time. So I don't think I've answered your question directly, in part because I don't know how things will shake out, but I think the consumer's in the driver's seat.
Mm-hmm. I wonder what you think some of the dominant or most interesting narratives are at the moment about the entertainment industry. What do you think, besides the things that I've mentioned, are kind of the storylines that people should be paying attention to about how the industry is changing?
The industry is so progressive and so in your face and so eager to share that across the board. I guess maybe 10 years ago, you'd have a bunch of content and maybe there's a Michael Moore movie, or maybe there's a movie about abortion. And it would sort of have a cultural component above and beyond telling a story. But what I see now across the board is just that almost anything you watch is going to have that element. I just watched a movie called Broken Hearts Gallery. It's a new rom-com. It's charming, it's sweet. And in the middle of the movie, there's this quick shout out to President Obama. And there are other points in the movie where they're talking about reproductive rights and abortion rights. And this is a rom-com where that really has nothing to do with anything, but today's storytellers need to inject those elements into the film, even if it takes you out of the experience, and it often does. So I think there's a lot of that going on. And I think if Biden wins in November, that's not going to end.
Mhm.
that's going to keep on going. I think that the storytellers and the artists today are completely in love with sharing what they want to share, trying to indoctrinate people. Sometimes it's done very elegantly and woven into the story in a way that doesn't really impact things. Sometimes it's clunky. Um, what I'm also seeing across the board in Hollywood, and it makes my heart ache, is a complete lack of defense for free speech, for free expression. Conservatives rally around Ricky Gervais, who will vote against us every time because he speaks up for free expression. We love him for that. He's one of the few people doing it. I think you should have the Clooney's and the Streeps and the Denzel Washingtons. Everyone should be speaking out on this issue. Everyone should be talking about it. And it's almost everyone is afraid in Hollywood to even say a word about it. If a year or two ago, Scarlett Johansson picked a movie project, she was playing a trans character.
Mhm.
There was a big social media outcry, and she backpedaled and apologized not once, but twice. Scarlett Johansson is unbelievably beautiful. She's very talented. She's probably the richest actress in Hollywood. She can open a movie. She's the most powerful person you can imagine in Hollywood. And in the blink of an eye, she was backpedaling and apologizing. That's Hollywood in 2020.
The uh, the aspect of this that I'd like to get into before we close out is any kind of rebellion against that exists, either in the indie creative sphere, directors who break with that approach. Are there creators that people who don't like the overall Hollywood woke agenda ought to be paying more attention to?
Yeah, there's a great new comedian. I don't say new. He's probably in his 30s. His name is Ryan Long. He's a Canadian comedian who's moved to New York City recently, and he puts out a video a week. And he strains to be apolitical. I don't know where he falls on the ideological ladder, but his most of his comedy really takes down social justice warriors, the woke culture, and it is blisteringly funny and thought-provoking and crazy. I watched his most recent one, and I don't even want to spoil it for the audience here, but I had my hand over my mouth because we've been so indoctrinated into I can't say certain things that I was almost afraid for him while I was watching it, even though it's comedy, it's meant to be outrageous, it's meant to be thought-provoking. So people like that, I really cheer and applaud. I think on the documentary front, we're seeing some really good conservative, right-leaning documentaries that kind of go against the grain. Uncle Tom came out a few weeks ago from Larry Elder. It's an exceptionally well-crafted documentary that gives voice to conservatives who happen to be Black. It's beautifully made, it's thought-provoking, and it really does work against sort of the cultural tide. So there are voices out there, but they are in the minority. And I really, for people who are right of center, who are aghast about all these different changes, you've got to support these artists who are fighting the fight. You've got to go to their crowdfunding campaigns and support them. If they've got a Patreon account, send them a few bucks. They are working against a massive cultural tide. They are the Davids against Goliaths, and they need our help. And without our help, they will flounder and they will go away. I'm sure YouTube would love to cancel a Ryan Long and say, hey, you can't do this because it's offensive. There's all that out there. Big tech is not on our side. And I wish I had more examples to share, but those are the two that came to mind.
So I appreciate that. In terms of looking at the next year's Oscars, are they going to have to dramatically change their standards for what movies and films are able to qualify for nomination, just based on the realities of who got theater releases and just having to fill up the categories? Is this going to be just a heavily foreign film Oscars? What do you anticipate about that?
Well, the event itself has been pushed ahead a couple of months. So I think they kind of maybe gave us wiggle room there. I don't know. In recent years, we've had this shift where if it's an HBO movie, it's an Emmy nominee potentially, but it's not an Oscar film. But then Netflix got into the Martin Scorsese business, and all of a sudden a Netflix movie can be considered. So the rules and the cultural rules are shifting and changing. But I look at what movies I've seen this year, I'd be hard pressed to come up with the best three movies of the year. It's just that the pickings have been so slim. So it's very possible we will see some shifting. Movies that were on video on demand may qualify. I don't know the exact rules. I suspect that the Oscar voters and the Academy doesn't know the exact rules yet.
Rather than a list of best of, it will be movies of this year. Christian, I think that it's going to be a challenge. So we'll have to see them figure out how to navigate that. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, Christian Toto.
Sure, my pleasure.
I'm Ben Dominich. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.